Okay, so today's verses are with the power of kindness and compassion and the altruistic vow of the Bodhi-Heart. So a couple of days ago, I downloaded the whole text of the Shepherd's Search for Mind with Bhante's seminar because I wanted to see the whole context of the text we're looking at. And I was just struck by what a good story it is, the Shepherd's Search for Mind. And you can't hear me. I'll try and shout a bit louder. And I don't know if you remember how the story starts. A couple of shepherd lads are up in the mountains and they come across Milarepa in his cave. And so they find this half-naked, ascetic, long hair in a cave, probably up near the snow line. And one of the lads comes along and says, "What are you doing here? Haven't you got any mates? And where are your friends?" I think. And Milarepa replies, "Actually, I have got a friend. He's called Bodhicitta." And the shepherd boy said, "Well, where is he? Now, where does he live?" And he says, "He lives in the storehouse consciousness." And the shepherd boy, "Well, where is that?" He says, "In my own body." So the whole story starts off with this dialogue, and in a sense you could think, well, maybe Milarepa is kind of playing a bit with the shepherd boy, but also I do get this sense that for Milarepa, the Bodhicitta is like a kind of a good friend. It's like his best friend. It's with him always, never leaves him alone. He. What pronoun do you use for the Bodhicitta? Though it's sort of it's a personality. It's a consciousness. It's not a thing, is it? And then reading the story, I couldn't help but think that here we have one of the greatest Buddhist teachers that's ever lived coming into contact with a 16-year-old youth. Couldn't something about this story tell us about how to communicate the Dharma to young people? Now, we're talking a lot about how do we communicate the Dharma to young people. I did a little analysis and I came up with like 4 points of how Milarepa communicates to this 16-year-old youth. But I'm not going to tell you them because Lokeshwar has told me I've got to be really tight on the time and it's going off the topic. So I'll just have to leave that there. I think there's something very interesting in this story about how do you communicate the Dharma to young people. But my topic is positive emotion as a Vipassana practice. Okay, so at Pamaloka in May this year, Kamala Sheila gave a talk which was called Triratna's Insight Tradition, A Community in the Making. I wasn't there present at Pamaloka, but Kamala Sheila very kindly made the transcript of his talk available and I got to read it. And it's one of these things that you read and I just found myself going, yes, yes, yes. Everything he was saying in the talk, I thought, great, this is really good. And I just wanted to quote a couple of things from the talk. So the first thing, he's talking about our practice in the movement and the order in the 80s, basically. Particularly the whole perspective, the emphasis that Bhante gives that first of all we have to practice samatha meditation and then we have to practice vipassana meditation. So first of all, he says, our idea of how this works in practice was a bit literal. It was rather black and white. You either have perfect samatha or you don't. If you don't, then vipassana is pointless or alienating or is self-delusion. That's what we thought. We had a tendency to feel we shouldn't start insight practice at all unless we could sit in dhyana. Okay. And then a bit later on in the talk, he says the following. He says, I think what needs to change is that we all need actually to engage with insight, which means no longer just practicing the minimum samatha meditation we need to get by, and having a vague idea that wisdom will come along naturally when we're ready. And then he carries on. But it was this line, I think, the vague idea, the minimum of samatha to get by, and a vague idea of wisdom that resonated with me a lot, because I really feel that he's describing in this talk, he's very much describing what my first kind of 22 years of practice in the order were like, really. That was what my practice was like. And in the last 7 or 8 years, I've really turned my practice around. I've begun to practice in a different way, not this rather literal, narrow idea of you've got to get into dhyana before you can practice insight. because I wasn't getting into dhyana, so how was I going to practice insight? I've maybe had one or two experiences of dhyana in my whole life. So what I want to talk about in this talk is that process that I went through of turning around my practice, and how I became interested particularly in positive emotion as an insight practice. And then the second part of the talk, I actually want to look specifically at Metta Bhavana as an insight practice. So that's what the talk is going to be. So, and in giving this talk, one thing I feel I have to say in a way is that I don't consider myself to be kind of an expert on the subject. No, I can look around here. If I think of the two aspects of the talk, insight, well, I know there's people here who can see more clearly and deeply the nature of things as they are than I can. And if I think about metta, well, I know there's people who are just much more friendly and kind than I am. So I can't sort of say I'm going to give a talk because I kind of worked it all out. It's more that I'm still working this all out, and it's been in a way kind of quite a struggle for me. But sometimes it can be quite useful to hear people's struggle and their journey, and that can help us inspire their practice. I'm not putting myself here and saying I'm an expert on this subject. Okay. And the first part of the talk, when I talk about my process, by the nature of the talk, this has to be a linear narrative. So I'm going to have to sort of say, this happened, that happened, this happened. And so by its nature, a linear narrative is very narrow. So before I start that narrative, I would like to just mention a few other things that were going on that give a more balanced picture of what my practice was like. Otherwise you might get a one-sided idea of what I was actually doing. So just a few things that were very important and helped me turn my practice around, even though they're not going to be in the narrative. I'll just say, first of all, Subhuti's papers, particularly reverencing and relying on the Dharma. Somebody asking me to be his preceptor. Doing prostration and going for refuge practice for about 3 years. And Bhante coming to stay in our community twice, and a tremendous connection arising to do with Manjugosha as a result of his visit. So these are just kind of other things going on parallel to this story. And the narrative itself starts with a book. Okay. So that book is Mastering the Core Teachings of the Buddha by Daniel Ingram. Okay. So this is actually, in a way, a very flawed book. And there's a lot of things you could criticise about the book. But I think this was something that was quite important to help me turn my whole practice around. So I'm going to just mention 3 things that are important from this book. One was, in that book, he really emphasises that if we're going to see things as they really are, then the place where we're going to see those things really, where as they really are, is right now, in this experience. So in this experience of being in a room with 100 people, seeing their visual forms, hearing my voice, sort of maybe a bit too absorbed by the sound tiles or something like that. The experience of being a bit uncomfortable in the chair, smells and sounds, mental events arising and passing away, skillful or unskillful mental events, all the different Vedanas associated with that. There are things that we find are nice, things that we find are nasty, and things that we think are boring. So we have all this going on in our experience right now, and it's in our actual experience right now where we're going to find reality. We can't find reality somewhere else. So I realized when I read the book, it's a bit like I realized that has been what I've been doing. I've sort of been somehow thinking reality was going to be somewhere else. So my practice began to focus very much more on this experience right now, whatever it happens to be. And then the second thing that I took from the book was his emphasis on the lakshanas. So that if we look at things right now as they are in this moment, then we'll find they have these 3 characteristics. So particularly emphasizing the fact that nowhere in those experiences can we find anything that has an essential nature, nothing that can in any way be described as a self or a me. And then a third thing, which I fed into my practice, I'm not actually quite sure if I got this from Ingram, but I've got the impression it came from that book, is to have a questioning attitude towards things. So we can find this in the Buddha's teaching himself, where he says, you should test out my teaching like a goldsmith tests the gold. So it's not enough to sort of say, oh yeah, if I look at my experience, there's no self there. Yeah, that's right. No, I prefer to take the approach of saying, well, was the Buddha right? Was he right or not? Let's have a really good look. Let's see if I can actually find a self, and actually trying to hunt it out and look for it, and that way confirm that actually I can't find anything by having this active questioning attitude. So these are the things I took from Ingram. There's a lot of other stuff in the book which people get interested in, particularly things to do with the progress, the stages of insight, the dark night of the soul, and all that sort of stuff. But I haven't that hasn't actually sort of done anything useful for me in my practice so far. Maybe I haven't got there or something like that. But what I found really useful is just those three very basic things, which actually resonate totally with the Buddha's teaching and Bhante's teaching. And it sort of kind of made me wake up a bit. And starting to apply that to my practice, I began to realise, yes, the free lakshanas are the way into the gateways of liberation. I began to really get a sense of how liberation could arise from looking into dukkha, looking into anatta, and looking into unsatisfactoriness, and looking into impermanence. So as I began to sort of think, yes, this really is sort of something that could work, then this question came up for myself, which was like, if I'm starting to really see anatta, that there's nothing to be found that can be called a self within my experience, in my direct experience, then surely that would start to have some kind of effect on my relationships with other people. Surely I would actually begin to notice that I'm a little bit less selfish. So if I become very clear I haven't got a self, I should be selfish. So I got very interested in the fact that Bhante says that metta bhavana can be a vipassana practice. And there's plenty of evidence to support this in the Pali Canon. Like if we look at the Metta Sutta, the Karaniya Metta Sutta, the very first line says, if you want to gain the state of peace, i.e. nirvana, this is what you should do. So the Buddha is saying, this is the path to enlightenment. And the last line in Bhante's translation is, such a one shall come to birth no more in any womb. So that's the very least non-returning. But because it's an early text, it's almost certainly enlightenment. The Buddha's talking about enlightenment. And Bhante isn't the only one who thinks this. If you want a hardcore Pali scholar, then you can turn to Gombrich's book, What the Buddha Thought. And I think it's chapter 6. What's it called? Sagramati? No doubt you know.
I gave up halfway through.
Oh, you gave it halfway through. But anyway, it's not his path. So there's a chapter on the Buddha's positive values, I think it is. So he actually looks at a number of different sutras in the Pali Canon, and draws out that the fact that he's convinced that the Buddha considered that metta bhavana was a path to enlightenment, the Brahma Viharas are a path to enlightenment, a complete path, and not just a path to dhyanas as the later commentaries thought. Okay, so what I felt was that in Daniel Ingram, I found a way of very explicitly, for example, turning the mindfulness of breathing into a vipassana practice. And Bhante says you can turn the mindfulness of breathing into a vipassana, but it's very, very explicit, very detailed. And I felt I wanted to do the same with metta bhavana. That metta bhavana is obviously implicitly a vipassana practice. Right? Obviously, if you become kinder and more loving towards other people, then it's a light to enlighten. But I wanted to make it much more explicit. I wanted to really explore this in my practice. So I started an investigation. So my first port of call was the Visuddhimagga. So it's basically our root text with regards to metta bhavana. The way I was taught metta the first time I walked into a Buddhist centre, I think it was Surita who taught me, is basically described in the Visuddhimagga. But because that's from the commentarial tradition, it doesn't really have much to do about insight. It doesn't really say much about it. I found it quite interesting, but it wasn't very much to do about insight. So I started looking around, and my next port of call was Free Buddhist Audio. And there I found, I think I'd listened to them before, but I decided to go back and hunt them out again. There was a series of talks by Subhuti on our main practices. And he got a talk about metta bhavana, so I thought I'll listen to that talk again and see if I can get any tips from this talk. And there he made a point which I found very useful in this talk. He said that metta, the practice of metta, is not a Vedana. Metta is not a feeling. It's an intention. It's a karma. So it's not a vipaka. It's a karma. Or another way of putting it would be that metta isn't an experience, a particular experience, or a particular type of experience, but it's a way of actually relating to all our experience. So this is the first kind of thing I decided to kind of feed into my practice. The next thing I came across, which I found very useful, I'm not quite sure how I came across this, but I came across the word advesa. And so we're very familiar with the word dvesa. This is the snake in the wheel of life, hatred. So advesa is normally translated as non-hatred. But it's one of these words that in the original language is a very, very positive word, even though it's in a negative form. So it's like in English we've got the word immortal, which means it doesn't die. So you could say the immortal words of Shakespeare, which sounds very different to the undead words of Shakespeare, for example. So that advesha is more like immortal than undead, if you see what I mean. So advesha is a very, very positive word. It's actually a synonym for metta. So advesha is the impossibility of rejecting or hating or going against anything. So that's a very, very, very positive quality. So I started to get interested in looking at metta as advesa, the inability to kind of resist or reject anything at all in our experience. Okay. Then the next thing that this is my linear path, if you like, towards being able to practice something like insight through metta bhavana, was I was very fortunate to go on a retreat at Padmaloka just after Basantra came off his 3-year retreat. And so he'd come off his 3-year retreat, he's in a very inspired state of mind, very tranquil, and I just felt I want to talk to him about this theme. And I can't remember anything about the conversations at all. I can't remember any of the content of these conversations, but I found myself being kind of gravitating towards him, and all the tea breaks, any fair, kind of taking the conversation a bit further. And all I can remember is he was just really basically affirming my approach. So this was very important. And then I saw that they planned to hold retreats for order members, and the very first retreat was on the subject of bodhicitta. So I thought, metta, insight, bodhicitta. I'd never ever felt attracted to the practice of bodhicitta before. All this idea of the black smoke, and that, I really just couldn't relate to that as being a positive practice. But I thought, this sounds very interesting. And this retreat was very, very important for me. In the retreat, we looked at what's called the 7-step mind training, which is a way of a bodhisattva training himself so that the bodhicitta can arise. And I also took up the bodhicitta practice. Roughly the last 2 or 3 years, that's been a very central part of my practice, is the bodhicitta practice and the 7-step mind training. It's part of my daily practice. Although I do have to say, I consider myself to be a beginner, a complete beginner of this. And now we get to the part this is that's most difficult for me, because the part that when I thinking about the time, I kept thinking, I think I'll edit this bit out, but I think I've got to say it because in a way the next point I want to make depends on this. This is that last year in March, April, I went onto this website, which is now infamous, called Liberation Unleashed, and I signed up for a dialogue with Tejananda, and I wrote out a phrase to try and describe this, and I basically entered into a guided exploration to examine what I thought a self might be in my experience. So there's a lot of misunderstandings about direct pointing and Liberation Unleashed, and the misunderstandings both from people who've not done it and people who have done it. And so, like, in a way, it's quite, if you've not done it, it's obvious that you can misunderstand it. But what I find more puzzling sometimes are people who have done it, who, from my point of view, seem to misunderstand the significance of what it is that they've actually done. So, I mean, one thing I have to, and in a way I don't feel a need to say it, but I kind of have to say it because of some of the misunderstandings. Like, for a start off, from my point of view, it's got nothing to do with attainments. Like, I'm not interested in trying to match up whatever it was I saw through that process with some specific attainment from the Buddhist tradition. Okay? But it was a very useful experience to me. I'm very grateful to Tejananda for giving me the time and the energy to help me in that way. And essentially, I don't feel there's anything in, let's say, the content of that process which is in conflict with Bhante's teaching at all, or basic Buddhism. And so what it is, in essence, for me, is just a useful didactic method. There's no need to bring in a whole new vocabulary. And so a lot of order members have found it useful, but we don't need to, it's not as if it were a different path that needs new vocabulary, a new way of talking about things. It's just a very useful method that perhaps we could incorporate into our own way of doing things. And in the context of this talk, what I basically want to say is that it only affirmed my vision of seeing positive emotion as a path to vipassana. Perhaps one way of talking about it is that is like our fundamental ways of talking about the teaching. We have the path of vision and transformation. I took a little step forward in terms of the path of vision, and then there's an awful lot of transformation to do. And so you can see my interest in the subject is very broadly based. Okay, my explorations have covered so the 7-point mind training, direct pointing, Visuddhimagga, Daniel Ingram, and all this sort of thing. But if I was to try and talk about how I see positive emotion as a path to insight, say by talking about the 7-step mind training, then a lot of you are not familiar with that. So it won't seem necessarily very relevant. Even if I talk about the bodhicitta practice, which is part of our core practices, it's not going to be so familiar. So I specifically want to talk about metta bhavana as an insight practice, because just as it were in the interests of communality and unity, so that we're actually all on the same page, we're talking about the same thing, we all know the practice, we've all done it. And so if I try and express what I'd like to say through that medium, then we're all kind of unified in our understanding of what I'm talking about. So it might be that I express some michadittis and all that sort of thing, but they can all get sorted out afterwards anyway. So the rest of the talk, I'm going to just talk about how to make the practice of insight explicit in the metta bhavana. I have to do a little time check here because Lokeshwara is very worried about the time. So I want to, and I'm going to talk about it in 3 steps. Metta towards oneself, metta towards specific people, and metta towards all beings. Okay. So metta towards oneself. Well, I think if we're going to practice metta as an insight practice, well, the very first question has to be, what do we mean by oneself? Obviously, if we're teaching metta bhavana to beginners, we don't need to raise these sorts of issues. But order members who are intent on awakening have got to ask that question: what do we mean by myself when I'm practicing metta bhavana? Unfortunately, the Buddha spells it out quite clearly. Now, what we refer to as being myself is 5 skandhas. 5 skandhas of conditioned arising. When I refer to myself, I'm referring to nice, nasty, and boring feelings. I'm referring to kind of perceptions of specific objects. I'm referring to impulses that arise. And I'm referring to this very mysterious bifurcation into rupa and vijnana, this the forms within consciousness, if you like, or consciousness with what it is conscious of. So this is what we mean by myself. We mean all this pratitya samutpada, all these processes going on under those 5 headings. Outside of the skandhas, there is no self. There is not something else sitting there outside of the 5 skandhas, outside of these processes. This is just the first level of shunyata, kind of beginner's level shunyata. You know, that the 5 skandhas are empty. There is no self in the 5 skandhas. So if we're going to practice metta towards ourself, we're not practicing metta towards some kind of fuzzy, non-existent entity, which I call me. We're actually practicing metta towards these 5 skandhas, towards these processes arising and passing away. There is nothing else there. So we need to actually tune into those processes, become aware of those processes, and start to practice metta towards that. So we're cultivating, as I said before, we're cultivating an attitude towards our experience, and that attitude is advesa, turning towards, not turning away, not rejecting. So we're practicing that towards eye consciousness, the eye consciousness of forms, with its Vedanas, Samya, etc. Ear consciousness, body consciousness, all those intimate feelings of hot and cold and hunger and pain and pressure and touch and smell and so on. And all those mental events, skillful or unskillful. So we're developing an attitude of moving towards all experience, whatever it is, whether we like it or not. We're moving towards it. And so whatever happens, whatever arises, we're just maintaining this openness and receptivity towards it. You could even use the word that we're just accepting it. But of course, Bhante has said in his points to order members, don't accept yourself. And so sometimes, so he has a very particular point when he says don't accept yourself. He's saying that the word acceptance has a connotation of approval or approbation. So we have to explore other words to describe what it is that we're doing when we have advesa towards all these different aspects of ourselves. But one word that is sometimes used is to allow. Just to allow, we're just allowing them. I've been experimenting with the word admit. I quite like the word admit because it has two meanings. You've got admit in the sense of to let in, like right of admittance, and you've got admit in the sense of owning up. So you're just owning up to the fact that something is going on. So if we're feeling some negative feelings, quite often we don't want to admit it in either sense of the word. So we have to admit these things. Okay, and so when we meditate, there's quite a lot of things actually we don't want to happen, which are happening. Could be anxiety, back pain, obsessive sexual fantasies, external noises, imagined arguments with other people, or just kind of physical exhaustion. There's all kinds of things going on in our experience which we don't really want. So if we resist them instead of accepting them or admitting them with advesa, then we're actually practicing dvesa. We're actually rejecting our experience. And I think it's worth asking ourselves, why? So I think the answer to that is that we're failing to see that they're just pratitya samutpada. We're just adding in this idea of I that's outside of the 5 skandhas. So you feel, I am being anxious. I am having this sexual fantasy or whatever. So if I am doing it, I can stop it. And then you just get into willfulness. So we just have to let it be. This is pratitya samutpada from the past. It's past conditioning. It's arising in the present. You can't change the past. This is happening. We can orientate ourselves towards a more positive future, but what is happening in the present is happening because of pratitya samutpada from the past. I've just seen the time. In the afternoon, I've been asked to lead a meditation in the afternoon, so I'm going to run out of time now. So there's a lot of unpacking I'd like to do in the whole of the meditation, the whole Metta Bhavana meditation. So if you're interested in the kind of approach I'm outlining, then you could just come along to the meditation, because I'm not going to get very far now. Oh God. Yes. So there are completely different approaches as well that you can take to all this, which are very. You might not find what I've said so far very appealing, but I think you can turn the whole thing round as well and do it. You're still practicing vipassana in the metta, but like through, as it were, the via positiva, not the via negativa. And Bhante says you can expand your sense of self, so it includes everything. And that's a very interesting phrase, because I think that is it's not him just being clever. He's actually pointing to something which can be a practice. You know, it's not actually a sense of self, it's more like an impression of self that we have. And that impression is actually in everything. So we can just sort of open out, which can take us very easily into the 3rd stage of metta, obviously. Right, so we've got to have a look at other things to do with metta, because I've only talked about the 1st stage, and I've got very little time indeed. So there's metta to specific people. So this is obviously like an absolutely essential part of the metta practice. And I'd love to say lots of things about it, but I'm not going to. I think one thing that's very important is this aspect of metta is something that really comes into its own when we're outside of the meditation practice and actually in the world with people. And it's a bit like that's when it really is important. But one way I relate to this aspect, which I enjoy at the moment, is like looking into the nature of consciousness itself. So Subhuti has given some very interesting talks on the 5 skandhas, particularly focusing on the skandha of consciousness. If we look at the nature of consciousness itself, there is absolutely no sense of me in consciousness. So when we come to other people, I mean, I basically relate to other people as objects most of the time. So every now and then I do look at people and I think, they're conscious too. But this consciousness, my consciousness is not my consciousness. It's just consciousness. And your consciousness is just consciousness. So it's just consciousness. So I think there's very, very interesting things to explore in that. We can, in the 2nd, 3rd and 4th stages of Metta Bhavana, we just can see that there is consciousness. It's not my consciousness, his consciousness, their consciousness. That's all I can say on that stage, because otherwise Lokeshwar is going to do something to me. And so I have to go on to all beings. So Buddha-Ghosha calls this breaking down the barriers. So obviously this, talking about consciousness, we can see not only is it not just my consciousness, your consciousness, it's just consciousness. If we start to really tune into the nature of consciousness in the last stage of the practice, we can also see that consciousness is quite simply love. It's just another, they're synonyms. Love is consciousness, consciousness is love. It's the same thing. Advesha, moving towards things, is consciousness. That's how we become conscious of things, is we move towards them, we admit them. That process of admitting is consciousness, and it is love. So in the last stage of metta, it just becomes pure love consciousness. The Santra leaves this stage of the practice very, very beautifully. It's just a lovely experience to let go of any ideas that it's me sending metta to them. It's just love happening. Okay? And that love is consciousness. So at the end of the practice, we open our eyes and we have to interact with other beings. So we can perhaps in Metta Bhavana touch on this experience of pure love, pure consciousness. But then we go out into the outside world and we have to interact with people who most of the time we're treating as objects. And so in the Bodhicitta practice, you have a very important aspect of the Bodhicitta practice, which is the fusion of the absolute bodhicitta with a relative bodhicitta, the fusion of love, of wisdom and compassion. They have to be joined together. In the Diamond Sutra, it says that the bodhisattva vows to save all beings, but at no time does a perception of a being arise. So if we talk about these sorts of things, they can all sound a bit kind of grandiose. So I basically think there's three things that we just have to do, and there are three things that we can do on a daily basis, moment to moment, every single moment. Very simple little things in a way, but they open us up to all this possibility. And then I'm going to finish. So first of all, look inwards. If we look inwards, we can just let go of all the tightness and resistance and pushing away and just allow a completely open space in our heart where we'd normally put the concepts of I and me. We can look upwards. So we can just allow something much greater to flow into that open space. So like Ratnaguna said yesterday, actually there's nothing to do. We don't have to do anything. We just have to keep that open space open. And the love that flows into that open space is openness itself. Then we can look outwards. And we look outwards towards other people. And the way we connect with other people is through very simple acts of kindness and friendliness. And letting go of our resistances. And we can always remember that even though they may not know it yet, in their heart of heart, all those other beings are also just openness as well.